Hello, everyone. I'm Bridget Rabin, and I will be doing my presentation on the known world. Um, I want to say, since we were assigned to read up to page 180, I took the option of analyzing two passages instead of including an article because several of them sort of give away what's going to happen later. And I also just want to mention that with this particular novel, the more I've been reading it, the more I've been enjoying it. At first, I found it a little difficult to get into, and I think that's just because there are so many different characters, um, which is wonderful. I mean, it makes the text so rich, but it was also a little bit confusing at first. But I find I'm muddling through it and appreciating it a lot more. And now I'm to the point where it's very difficult to put it down. So, that said, we'll start with my journal. This is a picture of the entire thing. Um, I struggled choosing between shock and knowledge to really discuss with you. But in the end, I decided to go for knowledge because, admittedly, there's enough going on in the book that does shock me, not necessarily in a good way, that I kind of quit adding to it, and I ended up just underlining things in the novel copy of the novel that I have. So I would like to focus on knowledge. First of all, and I'm not sure if this is a reflection on my memory or education or what, but there were Black slave owners, is my first question, which I also put that same entry under shock. It was not something that I hadn't realized that before, and I still question that and find that very interesting and perplexing all at the same time. I don't know. I just, like I said, I wasn't aware of it. So I put it under knowledge as in, it's knowledge that I've learned. Um, then I have this quote. The boy Timothy had struggled through 10 of each when the captain, a German Protestant, thought one of each would have done. And of course, his father died. And Timothy is saying prayers for his father's passing. An Irish prayer was obviously worth only a tenth of what a German prayer was worth on page 51 of my text. Part of the reason I put that in there, admittedly, is because I'm part Irish. And my dad, well, my great grandpa came over, was an immigrant directly from Ireland. And my dad used to tell me a lot about the hardships and things like that the Irish went through. And so I included it for that reason, but also, excuse me, also because this an Irish prayer was obviously worth only a tenth. I've kind of enjoyed that little bit of sarcasm there. My next one, Augustus stood up so quickly, his chair tilted back, and he reached around to catch it. You own a man, Henry? From page 137. I'm sorry that my picture got cut off a little here, but this is tied back to my first question at the top of the screen up here. So Augustus is clearly not pleased that Henry has decided to purchase a slave, and that creates a conflict between he and his father, which I think is understandable. And I wrote it down because I completely understand how or why Augustus responds the way that he does. And I'm still perplexed by Henry's character, which I'll get to with the first passage I'd like to talk about. And my next one, so he flipped through the book and settled on Job. After God had given him so much more, far more than what he had before, God devastated his life. Of course, I chose that one. That stood out to me right away from our previous discussions about the book of Job. And reflecting on that, I think it's very interesting because there are so many characters within this novel that I think have so much devastation and things happen to them that I can see a lot of that mirrored. I until we talked about the book of Job and Ecclesiastes, I guess I hadn't really paid attention to how influential those pieces are on American literature until now. So, of course, I saw Job and it just stood out to me for obvious reasons. Which brings me to my first analysis, which I mentioned Henry's character completely perplexes me. This particular passage is from page 84 of my text, and Elias has run away. All the slaves, the other slaves of Henry, believe that he has fully escaped, right? Because he's been gone all night. Nobody's seen him. And in reality, uh, William Robbins stumbled upon him and held on to him until the next day. And after Robbins delivers Elias to Henry, pretty much warning him, that he needs to make an example out of him, essentially, and take care of this problem, we have this excerpt here. Henry went to Elias and slapped him. This is a hurtful disappointment to me. What I'm going to do with you. What in the hell I'm going to do with you. If you want a hard life, I will oblige. I will oblige was a favorite phrase of Fern Elston's during her lessons, heard by Henry the first time as he sat with her in her parlor, dominated by trees, a peach and a magnolia, she and her servants had managed to domesticate. Her husband, the gambler, had seen it done by foreign people in a Richmond whorehouse and brought the technique back to Manchester County. Is that what you want? Henry asked. I will oblige you with a hard life. Part of the reason why I chose this passage is not only because Henry's behavior I find completely perplexing. He was once a slave. He was Robin's slave. And he just is so obedient of Robin's. And I feel like since Augustus was able to acquire his freedom earlier on, and then his wife's freedom, Mildred's freedom, years before Henry's, I feel like Robin's became this sort of father figure to Henry, to Henry. On the other hand, just knowing what his parents went through and all they sacrificed, to allow Henry to be free. I just find that very interesting that Henry is still seems to look up to Robin so much and just listen to everything he says, and follow in his footsteps. You would think that since Henry was once a slave, even a well-treated one, Robin's clearly had a soft spot for him. But I just find it interesting that he would still choose to go down that path. Even though he does look up to him and everything, obviously. So that was one thing that captured my attention. As I mentioned before, I just apparently can't seem to get over that part. But the main the main reason why I chose this passage is not because of that. It's because of Fern Elston's during her lessons, the oblige, that was her favorite phrase, heard by Henry the first time as he sat with her in her parlor dominated by trees, a peach and a magnolia. And here we seem to deviate from Henry punishing or about to punish, or at least contemplating how he's going to punish Elias. And suddenly we're in this parlor with these trees. And I'm thinking, okay, this has to be important. And I find it interesting that, first of all, magnolia is traditionally symbolic of nobility, perseverance, and love, which to me is kind of an interesting choice here given what's going on in the scene. A peach as well. Traditionally, a peach a lot of times in literature is symbolic of purity, um, longevity. It can also represent, sensual desires and things of that nature. But it's kind of sensual or not. I guess these two descriptions here, these two symbols, I feel like are kind of ironically placed within this scene. Since, like I said, he's contemplating how he's going to punish Elias for running away, um, which, of course, I mean, he ends up chaining him up for, if I remember correctly, several days, or at least a couple of days before calling in Odin Peoples to cut off a portion of his ear. So, I mean, it's not this gentle, loving, sensual scene, and yet we suddenly go back to Fern Elston's parlor with these trees, and then the trees come up later. The trees in Fern's house disoriented most people, those used to the inside always being inside and the outside always being outside. People said nice things about the trees to Fern, even as their minds were swirling. Those people were all free Negroes because white people never came to Fern's place. Henry had feared that Caledonia might want that done with their parlor. I thought that was interesting too, just the fear choice. I don't know if it's because of almost the gentleness and kind of femininity um, symbolized by the peach and magnolia trees. But that was just something interesting that kind of stopped me and made me question this. And I also thought it was interesting that we have this scene with a slave owner and his slave about to punish him, and then we have education also in this same paragraph. And um, I guess that's interesting to me because we would hope that, the more educated you become, the less likely you would be to own another human being, no matter what color you are or what color they are. Um, so that's what really drew me to this passage and why I wanted to bring it up and draw some attention to it. I thought, it seems kind of simple at first glance, but there seems to be a lot going on here that I thought raises a lot of questions. The next passage I chose is a little bit more lighthearted, at least on the surface. And it may be harder to see because I'm going to sneak in a quote that's near that passage, but I don't necessarily want to discuss the whole thing. But I just wanted to draw attention to it given the fact that we've talked about the book of Job and also Ecclesiastes, and I thought it was interesting. But first, the second passage is actually here on page 163 over here. You can see my underlining throughout, but at the top, this is the scene where Clara, so Skeffington is staying with Clara and her slave Ralph, and we learn earlier in this chapter that Clara is suddenly, just because of things that have happened to other slave owners and other white women, she's suddenly just terrified that Ralph is going to try to kill her. But then at the same time, at the top of this page here, 163, Clara cried and cried and said, "This old place, this old damn place wouldn't be the same if Ralph wasn't traipsing morning, noon, and night all about on it. So he chose to stay. His kin in Washington had never been likable people anyway. One of them was a natural born drunkard." He talks about leaving, and she is so fearful of him she does not want this man to leave, and yet, on some level, she truly thinks that he is going to murder her at some point. And to me, I mean, it was very amusing. Obviously, I'm sure you can hear it in my voice. I do think it's kind of funny, especially later on when she says, "John, I don't know what I would do if Ralph ended up murdering me. What would I do, John?" I thought that was pretty amusing. Um, and then down here later on, she up here. On that Sunday, the day Skiffington and Winifred left, Clara had been eating Ralph's cooking for more than 24 years, but after that day, even though she knew no more about cooking than a bird sitting on a nest, she fixed her own meals and she sat across from him while he ate what he had prepared and looked at her and spoke about happy times as she ate what she had prepared. Um, Although this is very humorous on the surface, I think it's also very indicative of a lot of the different characters that we encounter in this text and how afraid they are to really face their true emotions as opposed to what they've always been taught. I don't want to say hypocritical. Yeah, there are several characters in the novel that I feel who are very hypocritical. Clara, I don't think is one of those. I think she's just scared. You know, some of the people depicted in the book, they've grown up with this way of life. White people are here, black people are here, slave owning is okay. We are different, and we shouldn't. It's like people like Clara were taught that there has to be that difference. She would have been brought up to believe that she is above this other person. And yet, clearly, I mean, she cried and cried, does not want him to leave. She has feelings for him on some level. And I feel like she's terrified to really admit that. William Robbins is another one. I would venture to say he's a lot more hypocritical, but I mean, the love of his life is this black woman, not his wife. And yet, how kind is he to other black people? I mean, he's not. And it's, to me, this scene, as lighthearted as it is and entertaining and kind of amusing, um, brings that to the forefront. And it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't know, that Clara is, I don't want to say she's a total hypocrite or a horrible person, but it does show that she just can't come to terms with her actual emotions because they're in conflict with everything she's been taught and how she grew up. And I think a lot of the characters in the novel have this same inner conflict here. Um, like I mentioned before, the other thing I just want to mention briefly is right here on the previous page, page 162. And I know that we did not read about this, but Skiffington is reading from the Bible and contemplating things. And um, we get to this summary of the story of Lot and Lot's wife. And basically, the angels come, right, to Lot's home. They're trying to, in Sodom, and they're trying to be lured out by these men. And the angels blind them, warn Lot to take his wife and his daughters because they're going to lay waste to the town. And the angels specifically tell them to leave and not look back. Now, technically in the novel, we don't have what happened to Lot's wife. We have this brief summary of it. And then Skiffington looked up and followed a male cardinal as it flew from left to right and settled in one of the peach trees. Again, we have this peach tree imagery here, right? A red spot on shimmering green. The female, dull brown, followed, alighting on a branch just above the male's head. Winifred had always felt such pity for Lot's wife and what happened by her, but Skiffington had no strong opinion either way about what happened to her. So Lot's wife looks back and turns to a pillar of salt simply because she looked back. And it's my understanding that that's something that is open to interpretation, and people have different viewpoints about why that may have happened. But in any case, there's this last sentence here. The male cardinal was still there, but the female had disappeared. After he rereads, the story of Lot multiple times and then moves on to Psalms. The male cardinal was still there, but the female had disappeared. And I wanted to bring that up too, especially in conjunction with this passage that I just read over here about Clara, because as it says here, I kind of skipped over it earlier, but after 21 years, Clara would die first, asleep in her bed, a knife under her pillow, and another beside her in the bed, as close as a lover. I just thought that was a very interesting that the cardinal is inserted here along with the peach tree again. That's the peach is that same image. So I looked up the implications, of cardinal and how that may be related to the Bible. And I found that a cardinal in Christianity in the Bible would be signifying life or hope or restoration. So I thought that was a very interesting passage to have directly across from the one that I chose, specifically since Clara ends up dying first. And I do strongly believe from this passage that she had some feelings for Ralph. And then we have this, biblical tie in again, what with Lot's story. And that seems to happen throughout the novel. So I thought that was very interesting and wanted to share it with everyone and kind of see what your views may be, which brings me to my discussion questions. So I have two here. The first one relates to what we were just discussing. How do you interpret the allusion to Lot and Lot's wife in relation to the rest of the story so far? In other words, what connections did you discover? So for me, I mentioned, Clara and Ralph, but I feel like there's probably others. And I just think it would be interesting to see some of your responses and what you might think about that. And question number 2 is, how do you interpret the title? How is the title significant to the story up to this point? I know I didn't discuss the title a lot, but that's because I have so many different theories about the title and how it relates to the rest of the story, at least up until this point in the novel. And I'm really not sure which way to go with it. So, again, I'm just very interested in what you all would have to say. And that said, I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and that you've enjoyed reading the book so far. And I just want to thank you very much for your time.